Hello, everybody. We're back to that photo, that iconic photo at the Trump inauguration of some of America's most powerful economic titans, the men, and they tend to be men who run America's corporations. Mark Zuckerberg, Jeff Bezos, who was the founder of Amazon, Sundar Pichai, the head of Alphabet, Google, Elon Musk, of course, who showed up at the Trump inauguration. There are lots of interpretations of this photo. There are two in particular. On the one hand, some perhaps old Marxists would suggest that these are the men who really run America, the heads of the Magnificent Seven, the corporate barons, the men who not just run the American economy, but American society and the world itself. And on the other hand, there are those who suggest that these guys showed up to kiss Trump's ring and that actually economics is always below politics, and these guys didn't need to be there, but they need to please Trump if they're to continue to make profits. Our guest today has done a lot of thinking about our supposed corporate overlords and the corporation of the 21st century. John Kay is one of the world's leading economists. The book, The Corporation in the 21st Century, Why Almost Everything We Are Told About Business is Wrong, was shortlisted for the FT Book of the Year last year. And I'm thrilled and honored that John Kay is joining us from his home in rustic Oxfordshire. John, what should we make of this photo? What's your interpretation, at least in the context of your book?
I think not very much. I mean, the fact that they were sitting there does not demonstrate that they were powerful. It could look different in a year's time if they're still welcome in the White House and whispering in Trump's ear. But I'm rather skeptical about whether that will happen. And I think particularly Bezos and Zuckerberg are there because they're hoping for a variety of favors from the Trump administration. And I think they will learn over a few months that Trump's main concern is himself.
Yeah, I don't know if you need to learn that. I think most people know that. Or they should know it.
They should know it. They should know it.
John,
there's another aspect of this, which is I've just been writing, because this will go into what will follow, the book I've written, as something about the idea that business history is the history of great men. So it's all about Zuckerberg and Bezos. And without Gates and Jobs, we wouldn't have personal computers and phones in our pockets and so on. And I think that truly misunderstands the way economic history and business history develops. It's a bit drawn from, there was some Scottish economist actually, or Scottish writer, Thomas Carlyle, who said history is but the biography of great men. And there's a view of business history that says it's but the biography of great men. Actually, if Jobs and Musk and Gates and others had never been born, and Gates and Jobs had never been born, we would still have small computers, be able to carry computers around in our pockets. They would do the whole variety of things that they do. The way business evolves is, well, I've described it as the development, firstly, of collective knowledge, what we know about the world, and the aggregate of what we all know. And then that turns into collective intelligence, which is the ability of teams of people to solve practical problems with that knowledge. And that's the reality of the way the personal computing revolution has developed. And it's the reality of the way business has developed through its history.
Yeah, that's going to be quite a controversial book, John. I'll have to get you back on to talk about it. But let's focus for the moment on the 21st century corporation. Not a day goes by before without us reading about the Magnificent Seven, supposedly these 7 big tech companies that run the world. There was an interesting piece recently about the DeepSeek panic. Apparently there was $1 trillion rout on Wall Street after people panicked on the Chinese DeepSeek breakthrough or supposed breakthrough. What does your book tell us about the reality of these supposed magnificent seven? Are they quite not as magnificent as we suggest? Are they different in our conception? I know you think that we're not quite as separate from these corporations as we might like or not like to think ourselves.
Well, the question of whether this dominance is temporary or permanent. It's funny, I was looking at what would have been the Magnificent Seven in 2000, the height of the dot-com boom. Cisco was actually the most valuable company in the world, believe it or not. If you'd bought Cisco shares in 2000, in 2025, you'd be sitting on a small loss.
Yeah, I remember I was around then. I was part of the first dot-com boom. And in a sense, would it be fair to describe NVIDIA as the version of Cisco today?
Exactly. And the parallels between NVIDIA and Cisco are so obvious as I hardly need spelling out. And this is true over and over again.
John, not everyone is as smart as you. You might very briefly spell them out.
Yeah, people enormously exaggerate both the significance and the permanence of sale. We've just been hearing a bit more about the future of US Steel. We should remember that when it was formed at the beginning of the 20th century, US Steel was actually by far the largest and most valuable company in the world. And the 20th century was one of steady decline from that position. It's a long time since it was even the most valuable steel company in the world, in the United States. And of course, we now have rather pathetic discussion of whether it will actually be taken over by Nippon Steel of Japan or not. But I could tell this story again and again. I go back to the 1960s, 70s, when General Motors was the dominant corporation in the world. Everyone thought General Motors was forever. We know that they weren't for long, even the most successful car company in the world. And that story goes on. If you'd anticipated correctly that information technology would be the basis of certainly the early 21st century corporations, you would, back in the 1980s, have bought IBM. They were the world's dominant IT company. They survived through to the 21st century only as a rather second-rate consultancy business. It was Apple and Microsoft, companies that hadn't been invented till the mid-70s, that actually came to be the dominant.
So, John, what about the counter argument? I'm not sure I believe this, but we hear it quite often on the show that tech has changed everything. You mentioned Apple and Microsoft. They're two of the Magnificent Seven, I think, depending on daily valuations. They're probably the two most valuable companies in the world, both worth somewhere around $3 trillion. They were major players certainly in the 90s, and they've retained their control. Google, Amazon, Facebook have all invested massively in AI. Hundreds of billions of dollars now are going into AI. And some people believe that this is changing the rules of the corporation, that in our AI age, we're going to have these companies that are wealthier and more powerful than nation states. Is that simply wrong?
I think it is simply wrong. We've already been talking about where things were in 2000 at the end of the dot-com boom. And people were saying just these things then. I remember how I was told so often that I just didn't get it. That was the phrase. There was, in fact, not very much to get. But the story of the dot-com boom, actually, is that in the dot-com boom, people grossly overestimated the short-term impact of these changes, and yet underestimated the long-run change impact, because the internet and things around it have actually changed the business. They've changed our lives. It's just taken 25 years for us to even to see a large part of that change, and there's quite a lot yet to come. I think people will say the same about AI in a few decades.
So do you disagree? Last year, Simon Johnson was one of the winners of the Nobel Prize for Economics. He has an interesting book out. He was on the show last year. I think his book was shortlisted for the FT Book of the Year a couple of years ago, suggesting that economics has become less democratic, that these powerful companies and individuals, the multi-billionaires of our age, are different from the entrepreneurs, the innovators, the capitalists drove the first industrial revolution. You're all too familiar as a Scottish economist with that. Is Jenkins wrong?
No, there's quite a lot in that. And the world has, in this sense, changed. If we go back to the Industrial Revolution, the time of Adam Smith and the like we're talking about, what happened was rich men whose wealth had been accumulated from agriculture, essentially, what Smith called prior accumulation, Marx primitive accumulation. They'd assembled money from these kind of sources, and they got together. Even then, they got together with entrepreneurs, so people who weren't particularly rich to begin with, but were interested in business. And they built steel plants and they built textile mills. And that was the basis of the Industrial Revolution. Through the 20th, through the 19th century, that developed, and we got stock markets as wealthy individuals, middle-class people with some savings to spare, helped to build railroads. They provided money to build railroads. They didn't actually build them themselves. And of course, into the 20th century, we got automobile plants. If we'd been having this discussion a century ago, we'd have been talking very excitedly about what Henry Ford had done at the River Rouge, building what was certainly then the largest industrial facility in the world. I suspect it's the largest industrial facility there ever will be. And it was a huge plant. It was vastly expensive. For Ford, Ford insisted on controlling everything. So there's even an area of Brazil which is still called Fordlandia, because that's where Henry Ford planted rubber trees to ensure that even the tires on Ford cars were made from Ford rubber.
Of course, in Aldous Huxley's Brave New World, the religion was Ford, so he was satirizing the world. He wasn't inventing anything.
No, but Ford was the archetype of that. So even by the mid of the century, General Motors had overtaken Ford, but neither Ford nor General Motors are now even the largest automobile company.
So John, how does you mentioned Henry Ford? How does he compare with somebody like Jeff Bezos, who also wanted to control everything in Amazon? They have their own trucks, their own distribution centers, their own brand. Is there a fundamental difference between Ford and Bezos, or are they essentially working off the same corporate model?
Yeah, well, there is one very big difference, which is, you said, for Jeff Bezos has the Amazon vans and the Amazon warehouses. Actually, he doesn't. When you pass an Amazon warehouse, it's or fulfillment center, they prefer to call them, it says Amazon on the side, but Amazon don't own it, or Amazon almost certainly don't own it. The largest owner of Amazon facilities in the world, or warehouses in the world, is Prologis, or a San Francisco-based real estate investment trust. The vans are similarly, some of them are in the gig economy. They belong to people who are moonlighting for Amazon. Some of them are leased by Amazon to people from the gig economy. Amazon, if you look at Amazon's balance sheet, owns almost nothing. And the same is true of Apple. And the same is true of a whole variety of these 21st century corporations. We now have what I think of and describe as capital as a service. That's what Amazon is doing. That's what Apple is doing. They're buying in the capabilities they need to produce their products. And Prologis doesn't control what goes on in an Amazon warehouse. Indeed, I suspect most of the people who work in an Amazon warehouse have never heard of Prologis. They don't know who owns the warehouse because it doesn't matter to them. They're employees of Amazon.
So, but this capitalism as a service, as you put it, it sounds to me like a more successful model, because if we, for example, compare Jeff Bezos with Andrew Carnegie, who was the original steel titan, you note in an interesting FT piece that Bezos is 400 times wealthier than Carnegie. So is capital as a service a more efficient kind of capitalism?
Well, I don't think Bezos is 400 times richer than Carnegie. I haven't looked at the particular calculation behind that. But in real terms, he's a bit richer,
aren't they?
Relatively richer, yes. Although we keep reading in the paper every day now that Elon Musk is the richest man in the world. How much of that market capitalization is actually in a real sense available to Elon Musk is, I think, a very open question. If he tried to cash that in, could he collect $3 trillion for his stake in Tesla? I rather doubt it. But you're right. These businesses are larger in real terms even than Carnegie's was, or others before it. But they're that valuable for rather curious reasons. If one looks at that Amazon balance sheet or the Apple balance sheet, you discover, as I was describing, they don't own anything. All the market value, or virtually all the market value of these companies, is a hope of the profits they might earn in future. Now, there are two observations to be made there. One is, will they actually earn these profits in future? Was Nvidia ever worth $3 trillion? I rather doubt it. Will Nvidia ever generate cash on that kind of scale? I'm pretty sure it won't. But there's a contrast there between the value that is based on hopes of profits that companies might earn future and the fortune of Carnegie that was derived entirely or almost entirely from actual physical steelworks that you could touch and feel and you could sell to somebody else. And ultimately, of course, Carnegie did when US Steel was formed.
Is this a warning, in a sense, John, about the kind of capitalism and corporation you're presenting, a speculative corporation or capitalism where we're always imagining the future? These companies don't actually own anything, and we're just imagining how many chips NVIDIA can produce to power the AI revolution, which accounts for their enormous value. Are you suggesting that the whole thing is one endless bubble, or do you actually celebrating that? Is this a good form of capitalism, an efficient form?
I'd find myself somewhere in between on that. Nvidia is a good company. Nvidia is quite valuable. I wouldn't be buying its stock at anything like its present price. Nvidia is and all the Magnificent Seven really are good examples of the power of memes. In effect, people like the idea that information technology, artificial intelligence, new super chips and the like are going to change the world. And they're not entirely wrong to think that. But these fashions come and go. We've talked again and again about the dot-com boom and the belief that Amazon was going to or rather that some of the companies that were around there were going to dominate the world. Actually, 20 years later, as with Cisco, they're barely significant companies. I remember a journalist once ringing me up and saying, we have these so dominant companies. Are there any historic examples of companies that have been as dominant and have then lost the dominance or disappeared? And my answer was, it would be easier to answer that question the other way around. There are almost no companies that have maintained that kind of dominance over the long term. And I mentioned earlier IBM. IBM was once the most valuable computer company in the world. If you talked about information technology, you talked about IBM. Where is IBM now? And I can tell that story again and again.
But what about coming back to, let's just very briefly, because I want to move on, there's so much to talk about. What about Microsoft? Doesn't that prove you wrong? I mean, Microsoft is a good example of was it almost a 50-year-old company now that becomes stronger and stronger?
Well, I wouldn't say it becomes stronger and stronger, but
Well, certainly in economic terms, it's more valuable now than it's ever been.
It's more valuable now than it's ever been. That's true. But Microsoft is the striking example in the group we're talking about of a company that has successfully reinvented itself. You can find other examples of that. IBM reinvented itself, but IBM wasn't able to reinvent itself on a permanent basis. Microsoft did well in adapting to the changing world, but not well enough. We talked earlier about Apple. We talked about Apple. Apple go back to 2000, when Apple would have topped your list of the Magnificent Seven in 2000. And Apple, well, if you had bought Apple stock in 2000, you would still be nursing a loss.
John, given this idea of capital as a service and the speculative nature of valuing corporations, what distinguishes the Magnificent Seven and the sort of the mainstream corporate economy and what seems, well, some people view as speculative bubbles like cryptocurrency? Is there fundamentally a difference? Because they're also speculating on the future.
They are, and cryptocurrencies are interesting as assets that have no fundamental value, in the sense that they're not going to generate a revenue stream in a way Andrew Carnegie's steelworks were doing. But people buy cryptocurrencies because they believe they can sell them on to someone else in future at a higher price. And mostly in the first few years, that has been true. Most people who were early investors in cryptocurrencies, or many of them, were able to make a profit by selling them on to others at a higher price. What I think we've seen is an illusion of the difference between real businesses, Andrew Carnegie's, which actually had physical steelworks that made steel, and the pure meme, which is the cryptocurrency story. So that some of these Magnificent Seven lie somewhere in between the two. They're not founded on solid physical assets in the way the steelworks and textile mills of the Industrial Revolution were, but they're not entirely memes. They're not going to vanish into nothing in some not too far distant date.
So, John, you have quite a controversial take on all this. You basically say that we're all capitalists now in this new corporate economy, that the Magnificent Seven are us. You had an interesting piece in the Financial Times saying, and I'm quoting you here, to see a modern capitalist, perhaps you should look in a mirror in the home you own, or take a selfie. Of course, a selfie would be taken with an Apple phone, and the home you own is part of this economy. What do you mean by this? Because, of course, certainly I'm not as wealthy as these large corporations. How are we all capitalists? Why has this changed?
No, you're not as wealthy as these large corporations. But I bet you have a pension fund that probably has has a share in these large
Actually, I
corporations.
have the best arrangement, John. I have a wife who works for Google, so
Right. But and you probably have a home you own.
yeah.
Actually, if you look at national capital stock, you discover in the Western world more than half the capital stock of Britain or the United States or France is actually owner-occupied property. That's the largest element of capital today. Now, the balance is it's companies like Apple, which we know, but the stock in Apple is quite widely held, or it's companies like Prologis. I bet most of the people who are listening to this podcast haven't even heard, may
But
not have heard of
I mean, you've
Prologis.
mentioned Prologis a couple of times, and I take your point, but what's their valuation, and why are they valued so much, so dramatically less than Amazon, since they're doing all the heavy lifting?
Well, they're doing the heavy lifting in the sense that they're providing the warehouses, and and Amazon needs these warehouses to deliver its service. But as I say, Amazon is buying capital as a service from this company. And the value of Prologis or any of the other companies we're talking about in this context of capital as a service is that they provide an essential service to the business concerned. And in that sense, their relationship to Amazon or to Apple or whoever is much the same as the electricity supplier or the water supplier or whatever. The businesses need these services in order to provide the goods that which they do, but the people who provide these services don't control the business, as we all recognize. The people who have actually control these businesses. Well, interestingly, it's no longer Jeff Bezos. It's no longer Bill Gates either. What they've done is they've built up professional management teams so that these businesses are now run by professional career managers.
But in what sense are we capitalists? Are we capitalists because I take your point, we own our own home. You also write about the significance of retirement. But is it because we all own stock in Amazon and Microsoft and Apple?
I wish we'd stop talking about capitalism and capitalists. It was an interesting model to describe the Industrial Revolution.
What's a better
Well,
word now to describe it then?
a pluralist or market economy. The great thing about the market economies of Western Europe and North America is that you're free to do things which you think are good ideas. That means we have loads of entrepreneurs. I think the word entrepreneur is quite interesting because I go back to the French origin of that word. And the French origin is an entrepreneur is someone who, in the literal translation, is takes between. The entrepreneur is someone who assembles a collection of capabilities. And the modern business, we're talking about Amazon and Apple again and again, but they're good illustrations. They're defined by a collection of capabilities. And that's the nature of modern business. It isn't defined anymore by the plant in the way it was in these steel mills or steel plants or textile mills, or it still was in the days of Henry Ford.
The word capitalism, of course, brings to mind Marx. Are you suggesting then that we should drop this word because of its Marxist connotations?
It's not because of its Marxist connotations. Indeed, it now has almost the opposite effect, that it means we attach an importance to a lot of what is going on in the financial sector that it doesn't really need or deserve. So that people at Goldman Sachs or London investment banks are endlessly talking about deal making. Indeed, business strategy is now largely a discussion of deal making. What units of your business are you going to buy? What ones are you going to sell? That's not really what business is about. It's a high level portfolio management. And I've written a book about, I take British companies because they're rather extreme examples but there are many others of companies that have been essentially destroyed themselves by inept deal making of this kind. GE, everyone's poster
Mm.
child of shareholder value, is a pretty good exemplar of that, actually.
John, your colleague, shall we put you're a veteran of the business school world. You've been involved at Oxford Business School for a while, as well as being a journalist. We've had lots of shows with business school professors, particularly in the US, places like Harvard Business School, who argue that in our age where there's a great scarcity of trust, particularly in politics and traditional political institutions, the only thing we can trust these days are corporations. They're the moral ones. They're going to make, and I know you don't like this word capitalism, so I'll talk about the market economy. They're going to make the market economy more equitable, more responsible. They'll behave fairly. In the last week, Google just announced that that they are getting out of the DEI business and investing again in AI for military use. So maybe they're not quite as moral as we'd like to think. Are those business professors particularly at places like Harvard, are they barking, so to speak, up the wrong tree? Are they should they be thinking about corporations as moral agents of change?
No, they should be thinking about corporations as moral agents of change, but corporations typically are not. Corporations, as I've described them, are at their best collections of capabilities. Successful corporations are groups of people with different capabilities working together. There is nobody in the world, literally nobody, who knows how to build a large civil aircraft, but thousands of people working together do. That's the real nature of modern business. And it's not generated by capital and plants, and it's not generated by some big boss at the top who's designed the aircraft which everyone goes away and builds. These modern businesses are groups of people effectively working together. They're based on trust relationships. One of the things that upsets me a lot, and there's quite a bit about this in the book, is the way in which we've undermined these trust relationships by a more individualistic approach that views relations as fundamentally transactional. And you don't build successful businesses that way.
Yeah, and I wish I could attend this. You're giving a talk next month in London on how business has lost our trust. Are there models of corporations who we should look to for building or rebuilding, reestablishing trust? Are there some corporations that you admire more than others?
Interestingly, the ones, and I mentioned this in the book, the ones I'm inclined to most admire are now some of the fast-moving consumer good companies that for whom relationship and trust in the part of their consumers is so important that they've been not very much affected by the business fashions of the last 20, 30 years we're talking about. That's the Nestle's, the Procters and Gambles, and so on. And I think it's quite amusing the way Warren Buffett, in a uncharacteristic misstep, actually attempted to move in to fast-moving consumer goods with Kraft Heinz and has managed to lose quite a bit of money in the course of doing so by subjecting them to the kind of short-term payback discipline, which has damaged so many businesses.
These are companies that a lot of people consider rather boring. So you're suggesting that rather than starting our own company, becoming an entrepreneur, we should perhaps go and join one of these large companies that you mentioned?
Boring is in this sense good. If boring is the opposite of deal making, in which you're if it's a contrast to deal making, in which you're constantly buying and selling a portfolio of businesses, which was the General Electric model, or a contrast to a world, and this was the General Electric story again, where you're obsessed with the idea of making the numbers. We've done so much damage to real businesses by this kind of financialization of their activities. I take in a couple of extreme examples from the UK, which are dealt with in the book. One was Marks and Spencer, which many of you listeners will know as the overwhelmingly successful and dominant retailer of most of the 20th century in Britain. It was along with the Queen and other things as the British icon. In the 1990s, the idea was our aim is we're no longer obsessed with quality, service, and value. What we're going to try and do is make $1 billion profit every year. Well, they made it once, and then sales fell off a cliff. They turned it round a bit and they made $1 billion again 10 years later, and they've never made £1 billion profit ever again. That's one example, but the more striking British example, even than that, this is Marks and Spencer was a classic British icon that messed it up. ICI was Britain's dominant industrial company for most of the 20th century. ICI's mission statement for most of that period was the business of ICI is the responsible application of chemistry and related sciences to business. And ICI began with a position in dyestuffs and explosives. It moved into fertilizers, agrochemicals, and plastics. It then moved in in the 1950s to pharmaceuticals, which they correctly saw as the future of chemistry and related sciences and business. They actually lost money for 20 years in pharmaceuticals until they came up with some blockbuster drugs, which proved to be the main profit driver for the companies. That was ICI. Then ICI changed its mission statement. It was no longer the business of ICI is the responsible application of chemistry and related sciences to business, which had produced a whole series of innovations and products and created a great deal of shareholder value. The mission of ICI, it stated, was to create shareholder value by focusing on businesses in which we have a competitive advantage and cost leadership. That business lasted 15 years as it bought some new businesses which it thought were exciting, sold at low prices the old businesses which it thought were boring, and in 2007 the rump of the business was finally acquired by a continental European country. The other story I tell about ICI is I told this story just before ICI finally disappeared. And a few days later, I got a pained letter from ICI's Vice President for Corporate Social Responsibility. He enclosed a corporate social responsibility brochure with it, which was, as you will imagine, you've seen them, printed on recycled paper. It included photographs of representatives of ethnic minorities in ICI. And the letter said to me that ICI might have screwed up the business, which was there was no disputing, but they'd done a great job on corporate social responsibility. I thought this guy is so far from understanding what real corporate social responsibility is. It is about building great businesses, which is what his former colleagues at ICI had actually done for 50 years.
John, you've been very generous with your time. Couple more quick questions. That story would probably be enjoyed by Elon Musk. All the news over the last few days, of course, is about the first round of cuts for Doge. Elon Musk has brought his, and you may dispute this term, his corporate skills as the CEO of Tesla and X and SpaceX to Washington, D.C. to revitalize, in his language, some people would say decimate government. What do you make of this? Do you admire Musk? Is he bringing business, competitive principles to Washington, D.C.? Is this a good thing, or is he the ultimate sort of corporate raider baron and putting all these thousands of civil servants out of work?
It's funny, Musk has changed from one thing to the other. I was a director of a British investment company that was actually one of the largest early stage investors in Tesla. And we made a lot of money out of Tesla. We had started having discussions on my board with about Musk's mental health as Musk became more and more of a public figure. And if I was still there, we'd be having more of that discussion now. Musk is clearly a genius, but he may not be quite as much of a genius, and that genius may not be as universally applicable as I think it is. I think there are a great many questions to be answered about how we actually get efficiency and professional management into the public sector. But I don't think what Musk is doing at the moment is going to make it.
Who's risking more in this? Which it's quite a gamble. Is Trump or Musk risking more in terms of their reputations?
I think it's very hard to say who's risking more. Well, Musk is risking a lot in that Musk began certainly 10 years ago with an extraordinary reputation. And Musk clearly is one of the business geniuses of our time. I said earlier, there are not many real business geniuses, but this man is certainly one. So that reputation is being endangered by this. What will come of Trump's reputation? Well, I think we may have a variety of views as to what Trump's reputation is.
Yeah, it may not have been much in the first place. Finally, speaking of Trump, of course, we can't avoid his obsession with tariffs. The FT headline today is US and China on the edge of a trade war as the tariff deadline looms. Seems as if for him, tariff deadlines are always ways of doing deals. What's your take as one of the world's most respected economists on Trump's obsession with tariffs? Is it emotional? Is it irrational? Or does it actually have any economic sense?
In the sense in which he's described it, I don't think it is. There is a role for tariffs in economic development, as, for example, some countries in Asia, like South Korea, have deployed them quite successfully. But the occasions, and indeed the United States, did at a much earlier stage in its development. I'm not saying tariffs can never be a sensible economic strategy, but as you're describing, in Trump's world, they're just part of the business of doing deals. And that's the background from which he comes. We all know that his famous ghost-written, interesting autobiography was called The Art of the Deal.
And finally, John, a one-word answer on this. Are you bullish or bearish on the world economy in early 2025? Are you a seller or a buyer?
I'm a seller. I wouldn't necessarily say I'm a seller for 2025, but I think a whole load of things, both geopolitical and economic, that have been sources of stability in my working lifetime look in jeopardy today in a way that I think they have not been over the last 50 years.
Well, there you have it. The author of The Corporation of the 21st Century, why almost everything we are told about business is wrong. John Kay is very good at correcting us. John, congratulations on the new book, on its inclusion on the FT Book of the Year award. And I'm looking forward to that new book on why economic individuals in history aren't quite as powerful as we think they are. We'll have to have you back on the show to talk about that.
I look forward to talking about it with you. Good to talk.